Over the next hour and a half, Helen and I will be exploring with you the topic of a watershed, helping people in their mid-careers. And so the space in which this inhabits is really the career practitioner, career researcher space. So that's the space in which we're inhabiting. Now, Helen and I have a common bond because we were PhD buddies. And so we actually met in 2013, and both at the time doing PhDs in career transitions. And so what prompted us to do this webinar in particular was myself being invited to be a NICEC fellow last year. So that was the trigger really for this webinar. So as a professional sort of background, I'm a chartered occupational psychologist, and I have my own business called Evolve, which I set up 20 years ago this year, actually. And really, in essence, what I've been doing in that time is about working with organisations, teams and individuals through transitions and change. I have worked with a lot of large corporations like John Lewis and BBC and PepsiCo and people like that. And also I've worked with entrepreneurs really at the beginning, you know, developing their organisations at the beginning of that journey. And in addition, I've worked with individuals. And so career coaching has been very much a golden thread through this 20 years. And so what's interesting is I would actually describe myself as a career practitioner who does research. So that's how I would see myself. And so since finishing the PhD in 2019, I found myself working with sort of more with individuals more deeply in their mid-career. And just to give a sense, that mid-career, you know, broad sort of definition would be 45 to 60. I know we could discuss and debate that, but that really is like the broad definition. And so in preparation for this webinar, I took some time to really review my client notes over the last 20 years for clients who fit into that category, and do like an informal meta-analysis to really think about what is this saying, you know, what are the common threads here, so that I could begin to sort of share with you some of the sort of just the interesting themes and golden nuggets from that analysis. So I'm really, really pleased to share that. So what I will do, so we've got a slide deck that Helen and I will be dipping in and out of, and you will get a copy of this slide deck. So I'm just going to have a go at sharing my screen. So hopefully you will see that. Is that okay? Is that becoming?
Yeah, all good.
Clear. So really you'll get a copy of this. And so in terms of outcomes from this session, so for me, there's something about exploring together what are some of the typical client presenting issues and challenges when we work with clients in this space. Also, perhaps what's the catalyst for them seeking help, and what sorts of interventions can help clients at this time. So, you know, what would be the literature that is useful, any models that are useful, any theory that is useful. And so I will share a little bit about that. And then also what's happened is I've found myself working more helping other career practitioners to work in this space. And so what is the support that we as career practitioners are needing when working in this space? Because it is a challenging space, really interesting and very challenging space and very rewarding space. And so my hope is that really by the end of today, by the end of 6:30, that there might be one or two things that strike you that you think, actually, that's quite interesting. I'm going to somehow weave that into my practice. So what I'll do now is hand over to Helen, who will introduce herself.
Lovely. Thank you, Cathy. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Cooper. I also occupy both a career research and career practice space. Perhaps unlike Cathy, I think of myself as a research practitioner. So we've had interesting conversations about whether we're practitioner researchers or researcher practitioners. I'm currently a research fellow at Birkbeck. I did my master's degree in career management and counselling there initially, and followed that with a PhD. And the fellowship now I do some teaching, some research and writing up some papers. So I think of Birkbeck's my academic home, I guess. But alongside that, I've worked for nearly 20 years now as a career coach. I have my own career coaching practice in Colchester, just north of London. I see clients mostly at midlife and later career undertaking some form of career transition. And I also work as a supervisor in more recent years. So I help and support career coaches looking after their own client caseload. And I guess across both that practice space and the research space, one of my real passions is connecting the theory and practice, especially bringing the theory across to support career coaches working with clients. Sometimes it feels like there's a bit of a mismatch between the two spaces, and bringing the theory across into the practice space is just a real interest of mine. So that's a little bit about me. As Cathy said, we're going to split this session into two parts. Cathy is looking more broadly across her career coaching practice. And then what I'm going to do, I've picked a career theory, a lens to look at mid-career transitions through, and that's liminality. So I've got several outcomes, learning outcomes associated with that second stage. I'm going to describe what I mean by liminality in the context of career, firstly. And then I'm going to move on and look at the role of liminality, specifically how we can look through a liminality lens usefully in terms of thinking about career transitions, what liminality brings to the career coaching practice space on that topic. And then finally, throughout really, I guess that's the second session, something about how liminality can support our own personal growth, some understanding of this particular theory. So that's the second stage of this evening. And just to give you some idea of how we're going to lay the evening out, we've split it into two sections, as we've said. We're each going to run through some slides. Cathy's going to start, and then I'll do the same for a second section. And there's a chance to go out into breakout rooms to have some discussion about the topic, and then come back and have some broader discussion. So plenty of opportunity, we hope, for you to talk as well as us. And we'd be really happy, any comments along the way, any questions, I'm really happy to pick those up right from the beginning. And we should also say, Michael's put in the chat that the session's being recorded. We won't be recording the breakout rooms, but the idea is to record the public spaces when we're speaking and when everybody comes back for a chat. So that just, I need to flag then and just have a think about issues around confidentiality. We're going to ask you to talk about some of your career experiences, and you might want to think about your disclosure around that, particularly in a public forum. But we hope by sharing some of your experiences, that brings the topics that we're talking about this evening to life. So I think that's everything from me, Cathy. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, thank you. So before I sort of share some of the themes from that meta-analysis, what I would invite you to do is, as I'm sharing over the next 15 minutes or so, is to think about, does this resonate with me or not? In fact, in terms of, is it something that resonates with you individually, or something that resonates with some of the clients perhaps that you've worked with? So that's just something to be mindful as I'm sharing. So as I say, over the next 15 minutes, I want to share with you some of the common threads from that review that I did. And so one of the first questions that I asked myself when I was looking at my clients over the last 20 years was, what was the trigger for them seeking coaching support? So that was just an interesting thought. So So whether it's worth as well yourself thinking in your own situation, what is the trigger that you notice that it compels people to actually want support? And what was interesting was that there was a number of things. So on the one hand, some of my clients were facing challenges in their life, whether it be redundancy, which is a very, very, can be a very typical question, a trigger for people seeking support, or indeed a bereavement, or in fact a child leaving home. Sometimes the clients that came to me it was some quite difficult emotions that they were experiencing that compelled them to seek help. So whether they were feeling fatigued in terms of the corporate life, they were actually on long-term sick, burnt out, or actually stressed. As well as that, there were other triggers in other clients, and that was almost more from an opportunity perspective. So some clients arrive saying, can you just help me work out my dream? I've got an idea. Can you help me put that in practice? Can you help me set up my dream business, or in fact sell my business, or manage the transition to the next role? And then also some people arrive saying, can you help me find my purpose? So it's quite a bold question. So I was thinking, this is just really interesting, the different triggers. And so I was reflecting on this in preparation for today, and I was thinking, what's this saying? And I began to notice almost like a theme around this, because there's something around differences in emotional state, some being positive, some being more challenging perhaps to experience. And then also in relation to that, there's something about where is the impetus for the trigger? Is it something from within ourselves, from the client's perspective, or is it something that's outside of themselves? And so that I wanted to share that with you, because I thought that's quite an interesting pattern. So I don't know how that resonates with you, whether you find that if you work with practitioners, or indeed in our own experiences, what quadrant is there a similar pattern, or is it sort of favoured in particular quadrant? So having thought about the triggers, I then began to think about, when I then work with clients, what are the sorts of issues and deeper challenges that emerge? And so I, again, looked at the notes, began to do mind maps, began to try and make sense of this. And what I uncovered was that it's deeply personal and complex. So it was almost a bit like there's almost like a starting point, the catalyst, and then it's a bit like a ball of wool. It's quite, the journey for each client was very, very individual and complex. And I want to sort of illustrate this with 4 examples, and these are anonymized, but they're still real examples, but protecting the identity of the client. So the first one is Claire. So Claire was a CEO of a financial services business organization in the city, and so she arrived burnt out, and then on working with her, her mind was so stimulated. There was a lot of overthinking happening, and from there she began to ask questions about who am I, and that then led to some self-limiting beliefs about can I be a psychologist, can I be that coach that was her dream? And that then led to us working out a portfolio career for her. So that was almost like following her path through the intervention that we had. Then there was Ben. So Ben was an MD of an organisation, and he sold the business. And he found himself literally at home with the family, completely disconnected and lost. And that was, when he began to reach out for some support. But interestingly enough, and probably quite surprisingly, he felt there was a level of inertia and procrastination there, despite having had a very full-on career running a business and then selling it. He was stuck. But behind that, there then became questions around financial responsibilities, because despite selling the business and doing well financially, he had a family with expectations, private school fees, etc. And so that became, began to really emerge, and we did some work around that. And then he began to really visualize, having done a master's course in AI, the sort of the role that he wanted to take on following this. So then we did very much a practical transition plan to enable him to realize that. The third example was Grace, and she arrived saying, "Can you help me find my purpose?" as I mentioned before. But having started that inquiry, what then uncovered beneath that was a sense of guilt. Is it possible that I can actually live my life and actually be this purpose, when beside her, other family members were struggling? And she found that very, very difficult to reconcile in her mind. And then finally there was Chris, and literally Chris arrived saying, "Can you help me, move from being a human doing to a human being?" So, big question there. And so, so when I was reflecting, looking at, preparing for today, I was thinking, what is this saying? And when you sort of stand back and you look at what was being said across all of the clients that I have worked with, there's something about physicality, some physical challenges that people are facing into. There's something about the mental challenges that people are facing into. Also emotional challenges, and then also perhaps more deeply the spiritual questions and challenges that people are facing into. And so this reminded me, I don't know whether you've come across this, I've put the source at the bottom, Steve Radcliffe Associates. I know when I did work at Boots, this was his model, and I thought actually this, in essence, one way of looking at what we do is helping to align people's energy and help integrate that to help them find their solution. So that's another way of looking at this. So the next thing I just wanted to share was, in working with clients, what are the insights or ideas or concepts or theories that we draw upon? And I know that we will have our own ones that we just resonate with, that that work for us and work with clients. And so there are those foundation tools that we may all draw upon, which are almost like a given. But then beyond that, I was thinking, what are the things that I know add a real value for clients? And I wanted to share this with you. And so the first is around contextual work and life, providing that context. So the 100-year life, the Grassman and Scott, you may have come across. I love this as a way of providing a lens on understanding longevity and how we can conceive life and work in the context of life differently, and how can we make longevity a gift and not a curse. And so that's a wonderful context. I don't know whether you've looked at that. Really compelling book. Also, Charles Handy, a text from the late 80s, the Cloverleaf organisation, different ways of conceptualising work, with The Age of Unreason and The Empty Raincoat. That is still very, very useful, has stood the test of time to help people conceptualise how work can vary. Midlife Understanding. I was actually recommended this book by a fellow career coach at a webinar, and I love it. Chip Conley, who set up Airbnb, Wisdom at Work book. I don't know whether you've come across this one, but he found himself in a really difficult position in his 50s, when a lot of his male friends went through a very, very difficult time in their career and in their life, and some of which actually taking their own lives, because it was a very, very challenging situation for them to face. And this shook him, and it took him to act and to begin to think about how can we help ourselves at this very difficult time, be the modern elder. So he introduces the notion of modern elder, which is a fantastic book, and I don't know whether you've come across that and used that as well. Another image which is difficult to see there, but that's the Carl Jung's the two halves of life. That is becoming increasingly relevant, I find, in the work I'm doing, and this is something which I'm going to do more research into, about helping people understand those two halves and what that means, and how that can help us understand people's different experiences. transitions and change. And I know Helen is going to do a deep dive into this, into liminality. We have the William Bridges classic transition work from his PhD in America, which may be familiar with, and then testing the water. Through my own research, I've developed 3 different methodologies, transition methodologies, under the brand of testing the water, which is I use when relevant with clients. And then just 2 more other areas. So psychology and personal effectiveness. There's so much to share here. And so I don't know whether you've come across transactional analysis. And there's a fantastic institute at Kegworth called the Byrne Institute. And that's one of, when you look back, the 101 course there, the weekend course, and then also the year-long foundation course, I found transformational. It's just an incredible insight into our psychology and how we then can use that into supporting people in their careers. And then also the Daniel Goleman Emotional Intelligence, which we may be familiar with, very, very useful, the mindfulness, emotion systems. And then finally, spiritual understanding is becoming more prevalent in the last few years, and actually supporting people in developing their purpose using the Simon Sinek and Brian Draper's insights in soulfulness. And we have a reading list at the back of the slides, which have these references for us as well, if you're interested. And then the Enneagram, which I trained as a practitioner during lockdown. It's a spiritual and psychological lens. And so that I find I'm using that more increasingly with clients. And so I'd love to hear your recommendations, and in the chat if you wanted to put those, or I know we're going to be having discussions shortly. So I'd really love to know your own recommendations as well. So then moving on, thinking about, so what are the interventions that can support clients through this challenging time? And very much coaching as we would know it is very, very useful, and offers many, many benefits, it being individually tailored, and also flexible. So in terms of timing, location, and that can very much lead to big, sustainable change. Very, very powerful. What I've also discovered more latterly, post PhD, is the power of developing retreats, actually bringing people together physically in a beautiful location, very peaceful location, and that can offer different benefits to coaching. It can help provide a soulful space to build a community for a while, that helps people then to begin to integrate their development and actually be very restorative, being in such a beautiful context. And so I now run retreats in the North Yorkshire, in the Lake District, at different retreat houses. And what I've discovered is, in a way, the topic of the retreat is less relevant. So the first retreat I ran was around building resilience, and in a way, what I learned was that it was less about the topic, more about the coming together in the community that is created. And so I now run retreats called Time to Pause, which is more of a general, where people bring their questions and we have guided conversations. And I'll be running a Enneagram retreat at the end of the year. So that's where things are moving. And so just 3 final things I wanted to share in the last couple of minutes, before we sort of open out to have a discussion and really hear from you. Since beginning to work with career practitioners in helping us to work with clients in this space, we do have particular needs to grow in this space. There's something about contextual understanding, helping us to really understand what clients are going through, and why is it that clients can actually feel overwhelmed, and what are the barriers that typically that clients are facing at this time. And also, as career practitioners, we're looking for strategies and tips and tools and questions to support us on this, in this space to work with our clients. And then, some very targeted support is useful to help build rapport with this, often intimidating group of clients. to hone our questioning skills and help reduce the client's anxiety actually working in this arriving in this space for doing career coaching work. And so when I sort of stood back and began to think about putting this presentation together and thinking about some of the emerging observations, there were three things that I just wanted to share with you. It's very much work in the context of life, so it's holistic and it is complicated. And what's interesting, or for us, is that level of complexity of inquiry is often related to the level of dissonance that the client has experienced, and also the level of development that they may or may not have done prior to the working together. Also, there's a timeliness here about clients needing to be ready and able to do the work and needing the energy to do the work. And so I've discovered that it's really important to have a network of practitioners in my network, so that if a client isn't quite ready to do the work that we need to do, there might be some additional healing work for the client to do. And so it's about helping to recommend and signpost into other areas. And then the third thing I wanted to share was that it's very much dynamic. So, and I don't know whether you find this as well, that by working with clients, it can then inspire us in our own development, which then we can then learn and grow ourselves, and then that then evolves into client work. So it's very much a dynamic experience. And so just finishing off with that question, so is mid-career change always a watershed? And I'd love to know your thoughts on this. And it also begs the question of what do we mean by watershed? Well, for me, a watershed is almost like a sense of moving from one value system to another. So it's quite a considerable switch. So it's not so much a milestone, it's a watershed. And so for me, I would, in terms of answering the question for myself, I would say it depends on the level of change that the client experiences through the intervention. And this is where we can draw upon Robert Dilts's work. And so in those situations where perhaps when we work with clients where there's some fundamental questions around values, identity and purpose, it may indeed lead to a watershed change. Whereas if the inquiry is more about an environmental shift, it may not be. So that would be my take on that. And so what I'd like to do now, stop sharing the slides in a moment, is move into some exploration around this, and how we will do this, because it'll be great to really get a sense of from what I've shared, what resonates for you or not, in terms of for yourself or the work that you have done with clients. And so how we will do this is in two parts, as Helen was sharing. And so the first part will be working in small groups, so in groups of 3 or 4 for 10 minutes, and just sharing almost like your response to what I've shared. Does it resonate with you or doesn't it? And what does it spark? And then after the 10 minutes, we'll come back and have an opportunity to share more generally and perhaps share some insights. So I'm not going to be asking each group to debrief. It's more about sharing those insights that you would like to share, to the wider group as well. So I hope that that's okay, and then we can sort of open it out to a discussion. So Michael, is it possible to open the? So welcome back, and what I'd like to do now is, for the next sort of 5 or 6 minutes, is just begin to get a sense of perhaps hearing from 2 or 3 of you in terms of anything that's interesting that's occurred, or any thoughts that you had that you'd like to share. Anything that you'd like to share to sort of the main group. So is there anything that resonated that you think, you know what, that did resonate?
Yeah, there was something, actually, I didn't bring this up in the group, but just something from your talk, which was really interesting, around the development of your retreats. and I run single sort of retreat one day workshops for senior doctors, and I run them in a barn, and I'll come out the
Wow.
barn, and the very first time I did it, I sort of said, but I didn't really mean it, that actually probably the main benefit of this is you actually being away and spending time in a group of people who are facing similar challenges. But I didn't really believe it because I thought my content was just, clearly going to be the main thing. And actually, over the dozen that I've done, I absolutely agree with you that it is about holding a space which is a space that's conducive to thinking and feeling some of the things that are really, really difficult. So yeah, thank you. That really resonated with me. And it's encouraged me as well to be brave and start to think towards a longer retreat. So thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a pleasure. And what's interesting is the retreats I run at the moment are 2 nights, 3 days, and that's a nice length.
Yeah.
But I know they can be longer. But obviously it's getting a balance, isn't it, with balancing our own life and the challenge, the responsibilities with our own well-being and development. But thank you, Lewis. I want to invite as well, because I know if there's any books that you recommend or articles that you'd like to share with the group, please do put them in the chat, because we will save the chat and you will get a copy of the chat. So it's really helping each other, sharing those resources that we love. And I know some of you have written articles and written books on this topic. So this is an opportunity to please, if you'd like to share, so that we can all get a sense of that. Anybody else just want to share? It could be a thought or something that struck you or anything that's interesting.
Cathy, can I just come in just for a second? Thank you very much for that stimulating input. It was great. And there were a few things in our group that resonated.
Yeah.
So around being ready, that was really interesting.
Yeah.
I definitely find that with my clients.
Yeah.
Also being holistic. So my PhD research that I'm doing in psychology of physical work for midlife women definitely sees it as a holistic, well-being related topic. I think one of the things that also struck us wasn't so sure if people are in a more precarious position, whether it's spiritual as such, or whether it's more about being authentic and meeting a variety of different needs in the next chapter of their lives, rather than necessarily being a watershed.
Yes.
And it also about maybe rediscovering who they are, rather than necessarily changing who they are. So even though obviously I'm interested in career reinvention, I'm also interested in what makes it a fulfilling. And sometimes that isn't always a watershed. It might be more doing something that suits you better than you are now. And authenticity, particularly for midlife women, comes through at this stage. But yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you.
Oh no, that you just saying that resonates with me, because it makes sense with what you're saying, because with the Enneagram, that is all about almost going behind our personality and connecting in with our true essence, our true sense. And so it's that sense of authenticity. That's really what it's about. So I do get that. I do that totally resonates. Rather than actually changing, it's actually peeling back and going within.
Yeah.
So it's almost like going within. That's really what this journey is about. Yeah, absolutely. And I think Carl Jung's work really touches on that. So I've got a couple of hands up. So Tristram, I think you were first, and then Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting. I think I really like the way you've kind of captured the complexity of these mid-career decisions that people are making, and how they're so bound up with so many things, from very internal things to very pragmatic external things. But I suppose inevitably I wanted to focus on the external things for a bit. And it seems to me that there are some very basic and obvious things that completely could reframe your capacity to think in the way that some of the people you were describing talk. So simply financial, the financial independence you have, the kind of pension you have, whether you're in a long-term relationship, or not, and you've got another earner in your house. So these kinds of like financial and social stability issues, again, are presumably completely reframe your basis to pursue dreams and so on. And it feels to me like we do need to keep that in view when we're talking about these things.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because as you're talking, you then think, your mind goes to Maslow's, doesn't it? You can almost drop right down to that fundamental foundation, or be, I mean, it's quite extreme, isn't it? That what can happen, and that makes it very, very challenging. Absolutely. And so thanks Tristram. So Michelle, what was there something you'd like to say, or
yeah, no, it's really nice to hear about the provision of career guidance, counselling, career coaching, but a different cohort within the population. Those that I work with and those that I've trained, we find ourselves focusing almost exclusively on those who fall into the NEET category. The thought for them of 2 days away is way beyond their budget and not their requirement at the time. And that's not to say that what you're providing is wrong. I think it's good, and I think often we forget about the wider populations and the needs of people who do still need time to take time out and reflect and think, well, where am I now, and where do I go from here? I noticed in the chat section that somebody recommended Caroline Parry's book, Change Your Story, and I was privileged to write a review on this. And likewise, when I read her book and her narratives of the people that she was working with, in a sense, I felt overwhelmed because their careers were amazing. They were high qualified, professional people, high achieving.
Yeah.
And again, we need to recognise that, careers guidance counselling, there's a place for all of us in it. It's not defined just by class or position within society.
Absolutely. We need to make it accessible, don't we?
Yeah, and appropriate. So, so thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. And as you're talking, my mind's gone off to when I did some work with Shana actually about this, didn't we, Shana, in LSE, and there it's like, how can we help people connect with their purpose in 10 minutes? And so I remember us having a discussion about that, how do you do that? And we did brainstorm, didn't we, Shane, about how rather than having a 3-day retreat, how do you do that in 10 minutes? And it's knowing those incisive questions, that, when you can be standing with somebody in a bus queue or, shopping, or moments, how, we can make that difference. So,
Cathy, I'm conscious of time.
Yeah. Okay. So Sarah, did you want to share, and then we can move on, and there'll be a chance for more discussion after Helen's session.
Yeah, just very briefly, thanks. In terms of the purpose, the charity I work with in South Wales, one of the things that I think happens quite a lot is people, women in this context, leave the work that they're doing, and it could be employment at any level, and they haven't really thought about purpose. It might be because of family issues, the things that Tristram mentioned. Health is a big one, and then they work with a mentor who is a volunteer. It could be from a whole range of backgrounds, and that's, to me, thinking about what we've been talking about, that is a really interesting opportunity to help mentors these people, to help them with the idea of finding what these people would be a purpose for these people. So
Yes.
that's like, it's not a professional thing, it's how can volunteers help people explore what their purpose is as they move forward.
Yes, absolutely. It's very powerful, isn't it? The possibility for us there. So what we can do now is perhaps press a pause to the discussion, and if there's things that are occurring to you, please take a note, and we'll continue the discussion. But what we can do now is, if Helen will share her input, which is almost like a deep dive into liminality. for 15 minutes, and then we'll have more discussion after that.
Lovely. Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share my screen here. So as Cathy's described, she's given a really lovely oversight, as it were, of her coaching work with people at mid-career transition stages. And as part of that, she gave the slide which had lots of different resources. And I'm going to kind of pick up from that bit there, but focus on liminality as a lens to look at career transitions through. There's so many different models and theories that we could have picked. So why did I pick this particular one to look at today? I've just illustrated here, I'm not going to go into detail, but there are, for example, lots of useful stage models, decision-making models about career transition. And like lots of models in this area, they're all very neat and tidy. They're helpful. They're really helpful. Decision-making models, for example, as practitioners, it's really helpful to know where in the decision-making process clients might be, whether they're in even any decision kind of making state of mind. And a lot of models are staged, so it's useful to know whether a client's just beginning to think about changing role, or whether actually they've been thinking about it for years and they're quite close to making the move. Because as a coach, the support that client need will vary depending on where they are in any of these stage processes and decision-making processes. So these models are really helpful. And I'm not here to critique what they do and how they help, but they do lack, for me, over the years, like nearly 20 years I've worked as a coach, what they lack is something that addresses the messiness of sometimes career transitions, and also the emotionality of career transitions. And as coaches, that is actually sometimes the really hard, effortful work that we have to do supporting our clients. So I've picked liminality today because there's something I came across a few years ago and it's kind of added in, I suppose, to my thinking as a coach and working with clients. And that's how I'm going to look at career transition today and what liminality can bring as an idea. So liminality is an idea that's used across lots of different areas. It originated in anthropology, and the idea behind it is that there is a transitional state as people move between stages of their lives. So, for example, as you move from childhood to adulthood, or late adulthood into retirement, and for us thinking about mid-career, you can think about transitional states as you move from one career role to another career role. And anthropology talks about liminality as part of something as a rite of passage. So you're in a particular state, maybe a childhood state. You have to leave and separate from that childhood state and enter a liminal phase, kind of in-between stage, before you're acclimatized and accommodated and moved into your new state. So that's the kind of broad idea about where liminality comes from and what it is. It's this kind of in-between state, not quite where you started, but you're not quite where you finished either. And there are lots of different ideas about liminality, as I say, from lots of different areas, not just career. It's been described, I think, really usefully. I'm going to talk about it this evening. Betwixt and between. I love that. You're neither quite one thing nor the other. You might be leaving an organisation and moving to another one, but there'll be a process where you're departing one and a process where you're joining the other, and that's a liminal state. Interestingly, it can also be described as a liminal state is one where you've stepped out of the normal structures. So if you think, for example, about being made redundant, you're suddenly no longer part of the labour market. You're outside rather than inside. And the structures and the systems that you'd normally be part of are suspended and you no longer belong. And liminal spaces have also been described, I think this is beautiful, diffuse, indeterminate and ambiguous. And this really captures this idea that a liminal space can be quite fuzzy and it may not quite have a beginning or an end. We might not be able to see the edges. And again, from a career transition point of view, that's a really interesting way to think of the liminal phase. So thinking specifically about career transitions, this liminal process itself, this movement between different states, situations, and professional identities, we separate from where we were, we move into a liminal space, and then we're incorporated into wherever it is we're going next. And we can think for career transitions, we're talking about watersheds, but career transitions can be any role transition. It could be changing job within an organisation. It could be a promotion. It could be moving across into a different department. It could be changing organisations. And it could be a really significant career change, changing occupation, a complete rethink and break from a career that you might have been in for many years. So what are liminal experiences, and particularly what are they in a career transition process? If you Google career transition and liminality, you get really contrasting images, and I'm going to share them with you because I think they shed some very different but useful lights on career transition experiences. So this one, black and white note, with a couple of coloured doors, and the liminal space is this gap between two massive cliff drop edges. There is a door at the beginning and a door at the end, but there is just this space between of nothingness that you could fall into with no obvious, at least from this picture, way of being rescued or getting across. So there's an idea that you can get through a liminal space in a career transition, but no explanation here of how you can do it. And actually potentially something quite frightening, a cliff drop edge. And perhaps a question mark over how you move to the other side. This second one reminds me, to be quite honest, of like a Hitchcock movie. It's a rather gloomy black and white corridor with suggestions of doorways along the edges and maybe an end, but we can't quite see where it is. And this is not a happy space to be in, potentially. It's possibly a really frightening and fearful space to be in, with no idea quite what's going to happen as you move through. So two quite threatening pictures and ideas of liminal spaces in career transition, and contrast that with this one. It's colourful and creative and lively and energizing, and this is another notion of the liminal space in career transition, something really exciting. And here we have another doorway, but this time we're moving from a darker, rather sort of threatening storm space here to some green pastures beyond. The grass is greener maybe, but again, there's something here about colour and a doorway and something beckoning that looks positive and exciting. So two really different descriptions of liminal spaces in a career transition, some very negative and dark and uncomfortable, and others really colourful and exciting. And if we look at the literature on liminality, which covers a wide array, including career, there's two different notions as well from the literature, talks about liminal spaces in career transitions in two very different ways. And the first is this idea of discomfort, not fitting. And the kind of descriptions that you find in the literature are a sense of being in a state of flux, out of step, not somehow in line with everybody else, something really uncomfortable, confusing, directionless, like some of those pictures, chaotic, being tossed along the way, frightening, really, really frightening, and lonely. You imagine being made redundant and displaced and offset from all the people and places that you knew in your working life. It can be filled with self-doubt, and there can be a sense of loss of identity because you're no longer who you were, but you're not somebody else yet either. So there are descriptions in the literature, really uncomfortable descriptions of what it's like to sit in the liminal space in the process of a career transition. And these are reasons why people don't transition. This is why sometimes people think they can't make the step. It's why sometimes they start the process and pull back, because these experiences of this space are sufficiently uncomfortable to make people pull back. On the other hand, there is also talk of liminal spaces in career transitions as opportunities for growth. So this is the colourful pictures that we saw earlier, the exciting spaces. And the kind of descriptors you get here are opportunity. The liminal space is an opportunity to step outside the norm. It could be a sense of freedom, creativity. They could be very energetic spaces, spaces where you learn something new if you're training, for example, developing self-knowledge, evolving ideas about yourself, and increasing sense of identity and confidence. If you contrast these two, truth to tell, as a career coach, most career transitions incorporate both of these. I have had clients who come who are so excited about being in this transition space that sometimes my job as a coach is to introduce an element of discomfort to try and pull them back, some element of sort of stop and think a little bit here. So there's sometimes something about pulling a client back from an overly exciting space. But more often than not, there's something as a coach about supporting clients through the uncomfortable and trying to make sure that we're thinking about opportunities for growth in what might be an absolute roller coaster ride of an experience for them. And as coaches, we sit there alongside to support and help and be on that roller coaster ride with them, but also help contain it and manage it. And what I really like about the liminality lens for career transition is it acknowledges these different states, the messiness, but also the opportunity to balance these two off as coaches, that we need to acknowledge them and see potentially what's happening here. I wanted to pick as an example, just to do a little bit more in depth. Many of you will be familiar with Ibarra's work, and she has written with various colleagues about notions of identity growth. So she's particularly interested in identity growth during career transition processes. And she talks about identity work, which is work which needs to be done. But she also talks about identity play. And as a coach, I love this idea. It was there's this notion of trying to sort of help and support often very emotional clients through transition. But Ibarra has this idea that she introduces of the liminal playground in her most recent writings, that we can think about and envisage the liminal space not only as potentially uncomfortable, but as a playground, an exciting place to be, somewhere to actually try and enjoy the process, however fleetingly, but to remind ourselves that it is an opportunity as well as perhaps an uncomfortable place to be, encouraging play. And when she talks about encouraging play, she talks about things like trying on different hats, for example. And as a coach, I like to think about using different methods, pushing the boundaries a bit. It is sometimes about the practicalities, but not forgetting a chance sometimes to remember a childhood dream, to stop and rethink, to pause and just think about what might be out there and reset. So exploring, being open-minded, because transitions don't always go according to plan, and being flexible, both the client and the coach. So, implications for career coaching. I just wanted to summarize these and perhaps pull out some of the points more clearly. Firstly, I think with clients, there's something about reviewing prior transition experiences and their liminal experiences. And this might be through discussion. It could be by something like a lifeline exercise, for example, where you ask clients to plot their career over the course of time, kind of positive and negative, and you see the roller coaster ride then. But there's something really helpful, and you can then ask questions about how it felt and what that process of transition was like. Sometimes I'll be explicit about the liminal idea and sometimes I won't, but in my head, this is what I might have in mind. But something about going back, because their prior experiences are likely to be colouring their idea about what a new transition experience and liminal phase might be like. There is also something as a coach, I think, about anticipating entry into the liminal state. We know it can be really uncomfortable, and that's what this lens shows us and highlights. But it can also be a highly, sometimes really exciting and energizing space. And that can be useful to anticipate and talk to clients about. It may be an absolute roller coaster ride from start to finish. And knowing that's going to happen and normalizing that for clients, I think, could be really useful. Monitoring how much discomfort there is in this process and how much potential there is a need for growth is a really helpful thing as a coach to do with clients, I think. And some clients come in, as Cathy identified so beautifully in some of her early slides. You know, if you have somebody who's just been made redundant, is in complete and utter shock and distress, it is not the time to talk about liminal playgrounds. But even then, at the back of my mind, I will have some idea of looking for an opportunity to just lift and colour the space in some small way, somewhere along my contact with them, however short that time might be. Encourage play. There's just something for us as coaches about how we might do it for ourselves with clients, and also how we can help clients do that. As I say, sometimes it can be pushing boundaries. Sometimes I've had clients who've journaled the process. Some clients like to draw. Sometimes we'll just talk and brainstorm and capture some of that in some way, but just something that can pull us away from this really uncomfortable process and give an opportunity for, I guess, kind of bigger thinking. Most of all, last but by no means least, providing emotional support. I work, as I say, as a supervisor, and I think the hardest and most unsung part of the work that we do is the emotional support, sitting with it with clients, the unpredictability of it, sometimes the painfulness of it, sometimes the joy of it. But that takes its toll on clients, and we have to be there and help and contain that. But it takes a toll on us as well as coaches. And so I think the liminal lens, I just find it a really helpful way to bring to the fore some of this in our coaching work. So what I wanted to ask you to do, we're going to go back out into breakout rooms for 10 minutes or so. And what I wanted to suggest was, you may want to just discuss liminality and how you feel about it, whether it's helpful to you. But in order to do that, it might be really helpful to think of a career transition of your own, potentially a client, as long as we're aware around confidentiality issues. And then from a liminality perspective, think about how uncomfortable that process was and why, and what helped perhaps get through it. And to what extent, on the other hand, you experienced growth. To what extent the liminal state was a playground for you or not. But this is just a hook to hang the conversation on, I guess. But then we'd be really interested to hear from you afterwards about what you think about liminality, whether it's helpful to you in your coaching work, or as a theory if you're a researcher. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And hopefully Michael can do his wonderful job of moving you out into breakout rooms. I think we have about 10 minutes, then we come back for a discussion. Okay, I think we have everyone back now. We've just been talking, Cathy and myself. We have about 10 minutes left, so we would like to use the time to hear anything back sort of in the first instance about liminality, your thoughts and your conversations. We were also going to suggest, because people have been so generous sharing in the chat, we're going to save that and send that out. So whilst we're in this sort of final 10 minutes, if you do want to share contact details, you're very welcome. Please do that. So I'm getting some feedback. Okay, seems to be okay. And so yeah, so please do share. There's wonderful resources in there, and we'll capture that and get that out to you. But if there's anything else you'd like to add, please do that in the last few minutes here. So yeah, any thoughts, liminality, any thoughts and feedback on liminality? Helpful? Resonate in any way?
Can I jump in? Helen, I'd say that
Please.
we were saying in our group that liminality is a very helpful concept, and we all had examples of it. One of the issues that was raised was about time length, because in our discussions we had some examples of really, really short phases of liminality, 2 weeks, settling into a new role, feeling established, or maybe 20 years of discovering a sense of true purpose and a flow in work where somebody could really sort of thrive. So I wondered if you had any comments on time length?
I think time length is really fascinating. We haven't touched on it. We were just saying we wish we had more time, really. It's trying to contain it all within our time limit. I think you're right. I mean, transitions can be short but incredibly intense and emotional experiences. And I've worked with people who've really transitioned rapidly, but there's often quite a lot of emotional ricocheting going on, and I think that can be really intense. I look back, to be quite honest, at my coaching career, and I would say it's still evolving, to be quite honest. There's also like, where does it begin and where does it end as well? You know, which is the role which we say, well, that the role can grow too. So I think there's something, that idea that the liminal space is not defined and is quite undefined, and having that in our minds, both for ourselves and our own, you know, work and life experience, but also I think sometimes clients think it's going to have a very neat beginning and a very tidy end, and sometimes trying to explain to them this is not a predictable process. I noticed in the comments several people saying, you know, how emotions vary, and sometimes people can be surprised how emotional it is. And I think for clients and for us too. Yeah, but time's super important, really interesting topic in its own right, I think, for career transition. Thank you. And I'm wondering, I'm conscious of time here as well. Are there any sort of wider thoughts about anything we've raised today, actually? And Cathy and me are also interested to know if today's been useful, if this is something we could do more of, I guess, or somehow, we don't quite know how, but if there's any feedback that's useful, you know, today, that would be helpful. Hi, yes, Wendy.
Just a quick question, really, more than a thought. When you've been describing liminality, it's often almost as though someone has left a job or been made redundant, for example. What's different when someone is trying to go through this process, but they're still in the job? They have not yet resigned. And you can't be fully liminal because you're still having to deliver in the thing you're trying to let go. Could you just comment on how is it different for people? Because Ibarra's work talks a lot about people managing their transition before they make a move, which I think is really interesting, but very challenging emotionally.
I would say for most of the clients that I work with and my own career experience as well, it is this messy overlap, actually. I think, and that's why I think the liminal idea is such a useful one. And you can sometimes say you can stretch a theory to any extent, can't you, to fit it. But liminal spaces arguably start in a career transition the moment you start to think about doing something different. And at that point, you haven't, exactly as you say, the challenge is often doing what you're doing. And we have, for example, I teach at Birkbeck people training to be career coaches, and often they are still doing their day job and training at the same time. And sometimes they leave their job during that process, or they're thinking about it. But you're having to try the new hat on and wear the new hat at the same time. And that's hugely demanding. It's messy because you're ricocheting almost around this liminal space, pulled back to your old role and pulled perhaps towards your new role. And I think one of the reasons the roller coaster ride exists is because once you start to even slightly think about doing something differently, that liminal process kicks in a really unpredictable and demanding way. And of course, some people think about going and don't, and pull back and never go. And they might put their toe in the liminal space and pull back, which again, I find that really interesting. Is that helpful?
Yes, it's very helpful. I think it's something we don't talk about enough, about that journey when we talk a lot about people who are made redundant or make a big sudden change, but this messiness, I think your reply is very helpful, Helen.
Good.
I think what I would just add as well, almost like a distinction that I came across, I found that really helpful, is that change is almost the practical external change, like literally moving role, moving house, etc. And the transition is the psychological reorientation. And so often the change can be quite quick, but actually the transition can take years. So it's complex. So Helen, is it worth sharing the resources,
Yep.
do you think?
So let me just share my screen because we've got a couple of final slides just to round things off. It's not letting me share. I don't know why. It seems to think that we already have somebody sharing. Don't know whether it thinks it's me. So what we have 2 or 3 final slides, which we'll send the slides out to you anyway. One has our contact details, Cathy's contact details, and mine if you want to get in touch for any reason. We're really happy to hear if anybody has any queries or wants to chat. There's 2 slides of resources, lots of the things that we've only had a chance to mention briefly to hear theories and books and things. So we'll share those slides with those resources at the end, and we'll share the chat as well at the end of this process.
And
Cathy, I'm going to just pass back to you to finish.
Yeah, so just before we do close the session, in the discussion, whilst you're in the breakout rooms, we were wondering whether it would be useful to ask the question to ourselves about from what perspective are we engaging with this. So we've created a very small poll to really assess from what perspective. So are we a practitioner, are we a researcher, or are we both, or are we something other than that? So just thought that'd be a useful way of just getting a sense of our own perspective. So that's interesting, isn't it? So
super useful.
Yeah, so more practitioner, some researcher, some blend of all of it, but more practitioner focus. So so great. Is there anything that anybody wants to share before we bring the session to a close? I'm conscious of time, sort of being 6:30. Anybody want to share anything? Because we I know some of the messages are coming through. So what you will have is that you'll get a copy of the recording, you'll get a copy of the slides, you'll also get a copy of the chat as well. So you'll get people's contact details. And we hope that you've enjoyed it. We've really enjoyed being with you today. And I know there's more that we can discuss, lots of energy. So brilliant group, brilliant discussions. And we hope to see you all soon when our paths next cross. All right, take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.